Welcome to Needle Stack. I'm one of your hosts, Robert Vamosi, your friendly neighborhood CISSP, and I'm joined by
AJ Nash, definitely not friendly neighborhood or CISSP. I'm actually a digital intelligence advocate over here at Authenticate, but as far as background, I got about 20 years in the intelligence community, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, counter-trafficking persons, chase war criminals, been in the private sector about 10 years, building intelligence-driven security practices and doing all these other things, the webinars and podcasts and magazine articles and all that goes with that. And today, we get to welcome a really special guest. Neil Ysart is here. Neil has over 40 years of operational, investigative, compliance, and leadership experience, including over 16 years working in law enforcement. He was Scotland Yard. He's also the founder of McNeil LCB and Partners Incorporated, an investigations and strategic risk advisory firm based in the Philippines, and the co-founder of the Coalition of Cyber Investigators, an international OSINT and cyber investigations think tank. Neil, it's a hell of a resume. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think I would just like to say that whilst I don't look my age, I feel much older.
Well, I don't know how to take that. I don't know if I live my age or feel old. I feel old today. I don't know if that counts for anything, but I've been up a long time. I recorded the first podcast this morning at like 4 a.m. So, which, by the way, it's awfully early for Neil. He's coming from the Philippines today. And as those of you may know, I'm in the Midwest and Rob's over in California. So we've got all the world pretty much covered today. So somebody had to be tired to make this run. And I appreciate that Neil's such an early bird. He agreed to be the guy. So listen, let's jump right in. We got a really interesting conversation today, Rob. Let's jump right into it, man.
Neil. What is the Coalition of Cyber Investigators?
Yeah, so initially the Coalition of Cyber Investigators was set up to act as a think tank and a vehicle for discussing open source intelligence, cybercrime investigations, digital forensics, and the kind of convergence of all those disciplines. But very quickly, in fact, almost immediately after setting it up, we found ourselves getting asked to do commercial work. So investigations such as boiler room fraud investigations, where open source intelligence has got a massive role to play. Data breach investigations, also some more traditional OSINT-based research, for example, for private equity firms and mergers and acquisitions, for asset tracing, those type of things. So as well as being an organization that pushes out guidance and research and gives views, we also do commercial work as well.
And how large of a coalition do you have today?
The coalition has got 3 or 4 key people that are responsible for setting up the initiatives and running that. And we all have our own companies, so it's more like an umbrella organization. But because my co-founder has also got over 40 years experience, I've got over 40 years experience, everyone's very experienced, we have a massive network. So what that means is literally no matter where in the world our work takes us, we've got a network of people that can support, a network of people that we've worked with before, that we trust, and we know will do a really good job. So that's the way it works. It's more like a matrix networking type organization.
That's really interesting. It's sort of like a joint venture or a partnership, a bunch of experts who have their own separate organizations get together. I would say it's sort of like the Justice League. If I'm going to go ahead and put it in comic book terms today, right? So you've got Superman's got his own thing going on, and so does Batman, and so does Aquaman, if you like fish. But they all sometimes get together and work on things. So I don't know if that makes it sound better or worse, but that's what I'm going with today. So as a conglomerate, as you guys do your own things, and then you come together. How does that work out in terms of setting up like the mission, the vision, the goals, the objectives? How do the economics work? How does somebody reach out to you if they want to work with you on something?
Yeah, we're very, very active on social media, LinkedIn, Substack, Medium, etc. So we get a lot of connections, particularly through LinkedIn. My co-founder, Paul Wright, is really well connected and very active on LinkedIn. He manages a bunch of very focused LinkedIn groups. So in total, we've probably got 40,000 plus followers in those collective groups. So we get a lot of connections through that. People come through the website, but to be honest, mostly it's through word of mouth, and particularly through the law firm channel. So Paul and I have worked with law firms throughout our careers, both in the the public sector and in the private sector. So a lot of our work comes through law firms.
Interesting. So it's we're going to talk a lot about open source investigation in this case, right? And as hosts on NeedleStack, we talk about open source a lot. It's not the only thing we talk about, but we just talk about it significantly. And I know this is a huge part of what you do, the Coalition of Cyber Investigators. So, but I want to talk a little bit about, you talked about, say, fraud, right? And where that fits in and some of the use cases you've done before. I want to talk about certain in terms of risk, right? So I talk a lot about organizations. Leadership really only cares about two things. Usually it's either lower my risk or improve my bottom line. And often it's just lower my risk of not improving my bottom line. But, when we get into risk, you see these risk scores and risk platforms, all these things that go with it, right? But you and I had some time to chat last week and talk a little about, where OSINT might fit in there. How does the exterior view, how does the open source research tie into organizational risk, and not just within the security organization, although I want to hear that, but how do you map that beyond the security organization? How do you help the rest of the enterprise understand what open source can do in terms of what you can find out about the organization or about others, and how that all ties into creating a better risk picture?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely spot on. At the moment, the majority of organizations are aware of OSINT and its uses, but it's within the fraud and the cybersecurity space. And people involved in cybersecurity do a fairly good job of using OSINT resources, but the broader risk side, our view is that OSINT has got a role to play in risk operations generally at the highest level. And we're trying to educate and make organizations aware of this. And one of the things we've done is we've produced a series of OSINT beginner's guides that are very focused on particular sectors. So, for example, we've done one for, OSINT, a beginner's guide for law firms. We've done one for HR and recruitment professionals. We've done one for family offices. We've done one on AML in the art world, food fraud. We've just recently done one on protecting your family, using OSINT to protect your family. So by making different sectors and different disciplines within an organization aware that actually in our area we can actually use open source intelligence as a discipline to help inform decision making, I think eventually people will start to cotton on. And arguably, people are doing it already, but they're just not doing it with a structure. So people will go on, they'll Google and they'll do some web-based research, but they're not kind of doing it within a structure or a framework. And they're obviously not having any operational security measures and safeguards within that as well. So my view is that eventually more and more organizations will start to take on OSINT. And we're already seeing organizations asking, well, could you help us put together a workflow for doing due diligence on a mergers and acquisitions scenario, for example, or for executive hiring, et cetera, et cetera. So it's starting, but I predict that as we go forward, as more and more solutions, technology-based solutions come online, we'll see a lot more of this.
I think that's really interesting. And you talked about these little books, right? These primers, I think was a term that had been used previously. Are these something you're just giving away? Are these something you're selling? Is it educational material that people can get their hands on to start learning about this, or is this part of a service? And there's no wrong answer, by the way. If it's for profit, it's business works on that. But I'm curious to know how much education is available for people who want to better understand these things, whether as customers or maybe just the general public.
Yeah, so if you go onto the Coalition of Cyber Investigators website, which is coalitioncyber.com, there's a section there that's got all these resources for free. So you can go on, you can take a look at them, download them, read them, and they're all there for free. We publish them widely on LinkedIn, social media, X, Blue Sky. There's links to them. So we do our bit to try and push them out. But the awareness is only really just starting to kind of pick up momentum. So it's like everything, you have to kind of work at it, lay the foundation. But that's kind of where we're going, and that's where the coalition initially started as an idea for a think tank to produce this type of guidance and potentially work towards standards and encourage the development of globally accepted and globally agreed standards and certifications, for which in the world of OSINT there aren't really any at the moment.
But you're sort of setting that standard, or filling the void, at least giving an example out there for others to follow in.
Yeah, I mean, we are not of the magnitude that could actually have the big impact. I think we need a significantly sized organisation, preferably a government body that takes it on. So for example, we've spoken to Interpol about exploring their appetite to work with us and produce a globally accepted standard. But we're struggling at the moment to find an organisation or an entity that sees it the same way as us. Because if you go back maybe 25 years ago, digital forensics had the same problem. There was lots of people doing digital forensics. There was lots of vendors developing tools. There was no globally agreed standards, and the community came together, and it's a very well defined discipline now. There's a standard way of doing it. There's recognized certifications, and that's really positive. So if you're a private organization and you're doing digital forensics now, you can take comfort that it's not going to let you down, and you're going to have your work output produced to a standard that will be acceptable in court. It'll be ethical, and it'll work within a framework. Open source intelligence is different. At the moment, you could have an organization that would do a piece of open source intelligence research in one continent, and then the other continent get a totally different result, because there's no standards. People do things differently, and there's risks involved in that. There's huge risks.
So that brings up an interesting point. With digital forensics, a lot of that had to be tried in courts to see what was acceptable across jurisdictions as well. So we're in the early days with OSINT, where OSINT practitioners are going into courts, and the courts are either saying thumbs up or thumbs down on what you're doing. And from there, we're deriving what the standards could be going forward. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's happening. However, I mean, there's a lot of OSINT technology solutions coming onto the market. You may recall, with digital forensics, the vendors that were successful would always support the investigators. They turn up to court and they explain to the court, this is what our technology does. But at the moment, not all OSINT solution providers have got to that stage yet. So it's going to take a while. There are critical questions that investigators ask. Where's the data stored? Who's behind the organization? All these type of things. Those building blocks aren't yet in place on a wide scale within the world of OSINT yet. So they need to be put into place. Those standards need to be kind of developed, and even with training, there's no globally agreed certifications. So organizations are in a position where they really need to develop their own frameworks to avoid those risks and to mitigate the risks that would come with essentially cowboys, cowboy antics when you're gathering open source intelligence.
Well, that's a good point. As a guy who's an Intel guy, right? That's my background. As I said, I come out of the agencies, and a SIG-inter by trade, and then all source. It's almost a little frustrating that we're calling it OSINT, right? That we're calling it an int, because the int portion generally means standardized, right? There's SIGINT and MASINT and HUMINT, and these all have, GeoInt. These all have standards. These all have years of tradecraft and practice and structure and certifications, and so open source research, which is what we used to call it, morphed into OSINT, I think partially because it was an easier term to come up with. But what you're telling me, if I'm hearing you correctly, is it's not nearly as mature or as structured, globally speaking. I mean, there are people who are very good at it. Obviously you are, and there are people certainly in law enforcement backgrounds who've been doing this kind of research for a very long time, long before it was called OSINT, when it was just called investigation. Journalists like Rob have also done it, right? Investigative reporting. So, this has been around a long time. But if we're going to call it OSINT, it seems like we've gotten that title ahead of where we really are in a maturation of what this is, right? This is still something that's very squishy. So people can call themselves an OSINT, professional, but there's no way of really proving or disproving that, it seems like, which is kind of concerning, I would say.
Yeah, it is concerning. I mean, we wrote a series of guidance documents based around a fictional set of characters called the OSINT Cowboys. And the idea of that was to highlight basically how not to do it. So I could almost guarantee that if you went into a room of 100 people and asked them who's looked up someone using their own Facebook account, then a lot of people will put their hands up. So those kind of operational security, risk mitigation safeguards, they're not embedded in the way that people use OSINT at the moment, to the extent that they need to be. Obviously, OSINT analysts, OSINT professionals will take those safeguards, but you still have organisations whose investigators will jump onto Google, jump onto Facebook, jump onto Instagram, and interact. So it's fraught with risk. It's fraught with risk.
So I think you probably have a good story or two there of a cowboy doing something wrong. Can you share an example for us?
Well, I mean, you can imagine a scenario where someone goes on to look at a subject's Facebook page using their own Facebook account and accidentally clicks a like. I mean, that's just a very, very simple explanation. And additionally, if Rob, AJ, and Neil go and look at the same subject on Facebook, for example, we could all end up getting different results because Facebook will generate different content depending on previous user habits. So, it's quite possible that we'd all get different results. And that's not a very nice position to walk into a court with three different variations of the same story.
Right. You have to be able to replicate it and prove that this is the way to get that information. And if you can't do that and you can't remember all the steps that you took, you've got a problem there. I think you're also mentioning when I was in the newsroom, it was tribal knowledge. It was like somebody across from me was doing investigative research and she first mentioned burner phones to me. I had no idea what a burner phone was. And, she was looking into a Silicon Valley company whose board of directors ended up going after her and going through her trash. So I learned just by, being in the same newsroom that these are things I need to be on the lookout for and careful for. But if you're doing OSINT on your own and for your boss, for example, you don't necessarily have that tribal knowledge readily. I mean, you can go to the coalition, obviously, and other places and get resources. But, how do we put guardrails around those cowboys before they get out loose into the world?
Yeah, it's difficult because it's in the same way that digital forensics developed into a mindset. It's a mindset, and I guess if you're going to ask me what's the one golden rule, it would be to verify. So never ever rely on a single source. Always try to find independent validation of the information that you've identified from multiple sources if possible, but from at least two other sources. So then you can speak with one with a degree of confidence, which kind of leads nicely on to another area which is sadly lacking, which is the grading of intelligence. So obviously, if you only have it from one source, it's difficult to kind of grade that intelligence as as super reliable and verified. But if it's verified from multiple sources and those sources are trusted and have been reliable in the past, then it's a lot easier to draw inference from that piece of intelligence.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good point when you talk about what's the value of intelligence, right? We've talked about the intelligence community all the time, right? We've got standards for that. You've got admiralty scores, and you've got the intelligence community directives, ICD 303, 6, and 8. So you can talk about possible and probable, and more likely and less likely, and there's all sorts of statistics. There's all sorts of structure that goes along with that, and trying to figure out how to make sense of things. But it's another question I guess I want to ask, as we're talking about these the cowboys, right? And this open space, right? This is still pretty open. It reminds me a little bit of this term, and I'm not a big fan of the term. For anybody who knows me, probably knows of the citizen journalist, which now everybody's a journalist, right? You've got a camera, you've got a phone, so you have a camera, and now everybody's a journalist, which is really insulting, by the way, to somebody who went to school for journalism and has, decades of experience in journalism. I'm sure Rob can attest to that. Just as I don't want to hear anybody calling themselves a citizen intelligence analyst. But here we are, citizen OSINT is sort of the same thing, right? Everybody has access to the technologies. That doesn't mean they're experts on how to use them to the best effect, or ethically, or legally, or morally. Just because two people own a firearm doesn't mean one of them might be a soldier with 30 years experience. The other one just found it in the garbage can this morning. They're not equally qualified to use that piece of equipment, and it's a very dangerous piece of equipment. So, what do you do there? Are you counseling people? Are you helping people? Are you dissuading people? I often talk to people about like staying out of the dark web, for instance. Don't go there if you don't know what you're doing. But OSINT, it opens that door, right? I've got access to my, to a computer, and I've got access to some tools, and where's the line? Can I go into somebody's private space? What if I have their password? Is that okay now because I have it? Does that make it legal? No. Does it make it ethical and moral? Probably not. Is it going to apply in court? So, how do we work through these things? How much of this are you seeing, I guess, is another question. How many people are coming to this, or how many people you're running into these, citizen OSINTers, I guess I'll call them for lack of a better term, that you got to keep them from getting themselves in trouble or getting.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. We wrote a couple of articles on crowdsourced intelligence a few months ago, and I think one of the dangers would be that when you have any sort of social community, particularly online, people's egos play into that. So if you can become a bit of a celebrity within your crowdsourced intelligence group, you may kind of lose any kind of inhibitions. You may lose your boundaries. So behaving unethically to get you up the top of that leaderboard might be an attractive option. And that's one of the risks. I mean, crowdsourced intelligence can do amazing things, and you look at missing person cases, etc. But there's also risks. There's also huge risks as well. So the standards that are required, and the safeguards that are required, I think it's incumbent on all of us professionals, whether you're OSINT or intelligence professionals, cybersecurity professionals, it's incumbent on us all to talk about standards and to try and encourage people to at least consider that ethical framework. A really good discussion point is how you treat breach data. So if you have a data breach, essentially that data is stolen, and then it goes on to a database. For example, if you look at let's just take the Panama Papers. Those databases are now regularly indexed by very respectable, very capable compliance database providers, etc. But if you roll it back to the key point, is that ethical or unethical? And we've written about this. I can see both sides of the argument. There's an argument for, there's an argument against, but it's these type of questions that are not resolved yet. So if those questions aren't resolved, can you imagine what some of the less clear cut, the more grey area type questions? It's really difficult for people to make a view, and it's really difficult for interested, enthusiastic amateurs to know what side of the fence they should be sitting on.
Well, yeah, you've got the vigilantism, right? So, you mentioned how powerful, group OSINT can be, right? Missing persons is a good example, right? I think, we've seen cases where there's been, large scale crimes, riots, things like that. And people are also able to, work and identify, oh, this person went here and here and here, and we figured out who they were. And, we've solved the case of the criminal, even though they were masked, right? And they thought they were safe from being apprehended. But you also have the flip side of, again, you got pride and ego involved, and people, want to get there. And so very rapidly it's, oh, this person, we found them and here's all their information and their docs. And it turns out they had nothing to do with this. They're completely uninvolved. It's coincidental appearance at best. And you can't really unravel that, right? And then people want to go the next step. As you said, they want to move higher up this hierarchy within this group, and so you have people that go further and further in that until they walk themselves into some very serious legal issues potentially. But it's very dangerous for everybody else. Again, I going back to comparing, this technology to a gun, for instance, you can't just go out waving these things around. I hate to use the most extreme example, but it's true. You can ruin people's lives with open source intelligence, open source research that isn't intelligence, right? That's just out there and connecting dots that don't connect, and creating scenarios that aren't there, and conspiracy theories that get fed into, and some of the dangers that go with that. And you end up having somebody that, is trying to shoot up a restaurant, trying to get to a basement that doesn't exist, for instance, in DC. So, I'm curious, you said, we've got to get to a point of standard that you don't feel like your organization is large enough to have that kind of gravitas, which makes sense, right? That's probably going to take a large organization or a government organization or something like that. I'm curious to dig in a little further if you have any thoughts on how, who goes about making that happen, right? Your groups, other groups, our groups, perhaps. How do we all go about that? And what organization, is this going to take a government? Is it going to be a nonprofit organization, a SANS, for instance, or an RSA, or whoever it might be? Well, I guess they're for profit, but, one of those organizations, RSA is definitely for profit, or is it going to take a government? Like, how do we move that forward before more people are harmed by citizen OSINTers, I guess?
Yeah. So we've got the skills and expertise to draft the standards. What we're missing is an organization with the stature to be able to draw the line in the sand and say, look, this is going to be the global standard going forward. And the influencing that the coalition of cyber investigators are doing, and others, is all helpful. And I am fairly confident that soon someone will pick up the baton and want to run with it, and we'll be there to help if they require that help. The answer to your question is probably, I don't know what needs to be done. We're doing everything that we can. So I would encourage you guys and everyone that's listening to this to also demand that standards are developed. Imagine if you are an organization that's genuinely trying to do the right thing, and you end up doing an OSINT investigation. You encounter something that is potentially illegal, and you mess it up. So you have a blue on blue situation because you haven't been operating within standards. You haven't been putting the safeguards in place. That well-intentioned activity could be disastrous. Here in the Philippines, for example, there's a big problem with the online sexual exploitation of children. So there's lots of operations underway. You can imagine a citizen-based OSINT organization all over that and interfering with a genuine law enforcement investigation. And that's kind of the danger that we're dealing with. That's why we need standards and methodologies that everyone plays on the same playing field. Everyone plays the same rules. But there's so many dangers. I could bore you guys with danger after danger after danger. But it just demonstrates the need for standardization right across the patch.
Well, okay. So actually bore me a little bit with some of the dangers, because I'm thinking in terms of like my physical security. If I, am doing research and it gets very dicey really fast, I'm personally going to be threatened. That's a risk to me. But there are other risks. There are risks to the organization that you're with. There's risks to the companies that you work for. Could you talk a little bit about some of those other risks that you allude to?
Yeah, so as well as the blue on blue risk, so inadvertently interfering with a law enforcement investigation, you also have reputational risks. You can imagine if you're a blue chip global organization and one of your investigators accidentally interferes with an investigation or accidentally reveals their name in an investigation online. So go back to the Facebook click or the Facebook like. The reputation of both the investigator and the organisation is going to take a bit of a battering. So you have reputational risks as well, but you've also got financial risks because, again, if you take an action that puts the heat on an individual that doesn't deserve that heat, then you could easily be looking at some type of legal action, some type of compensatory action, and so you have legal costs. You've also got privacy risk, and most jurisdictions now have got strong privacy legislation. It's really easy to breach that in open source intelligence and render yourself and your organisation expose them to that kind of regulatory risk. And I think as well that one of the big things that's not talked about as much as it should be, you also risk tipping off people. So can you imagine if you ended up in an investigation that touched on terrorist financing, for example, and you actually tipped them off that they're on their investigation? Well, that's not just the organisation, that's a personal liability. So you could find yourself in real serious legal trouble for that. So there's so many different risks, Rob, that it's quite scary when you kind of lay them out like that. And I think it's incumbent on those of us that kind of have seen these mistakes being made to make others aware, because not everyone's aware.
So following up on that, and I hopefully not encouraging anybody listening or watching to decide to take this on. I hate to give advice that's going to go out to the world, but at the same time, I want to understand better, how do you in your work avoid some of these pitfalls, right? So how do you obfuscate, for instance, what kind of tools and processes do you have to obfuscate your activities, from adversaries? How do you coordinate, or I assume because you're at Scotland Yard, this is probably an easy question, but how do you coordinate with law enforcement, international law enforcement, Interpol, maybe it's Scotland Yard, maybe it's the FBI, if you're going down a path that looks like it's going to cross over into what might be an active investigation? Do you have some strategies, tips, tricks that you're willing to share on how to do these things safer, how professionals accomplish some of these things now? Hopefully there'll be things that are just beyond the reach of the citizen OSINTer, so we don't have to worry about them trying to emulate it. But I'm curious about how you protect against some of these things.
Yeah, so the majority of our investigations are done through the legal counsel and the lawyers of our clients, and part of the discussion up front is exactly to kind of manage that situation. When there is a likelihood that there may be a situation that requires law enforcement to be informed of certain pieces of information, then that will be considered in advance, and it will be done through the proper channels. Both Paul and I have been trained over the years to operate covertly. We understand the safeguards. We're registered source handlers in formalized. We understand the safeguards, and part of the discussion with lawyers is to make them aware as well, because not all lawyers are aware of of these type of nuances. So I guess the overarching answer to your question is preparation and consideration. So preparing for all these eventualities so that you're not caught like a rabbit in the headlights when it actually happens. You've actually considered it. But that's the same with any type of advisory engagement. You need to be prepared. With open source intelligence, it's more about considering the potential pitfalls and dealing with them in advance before you actually start your research.
So you bring up a good point. It's not just you, the citizen OSINTer, that can be at risk for doing this. There's a ripple effect to your point about the lawyers that you work with and the other people that you work with. They could be exposed to that risk as well.
Yeah, and indeed, and the number of times I've spoken to my clients, whether it be lawyers or risk officers or compliance officers or FDs. And they said, that was a great report, Neil. We tried it. We went online and we found it as well. And you think, oh no, that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. That's why you asked us to do it, so you didn't have to do it yourself and take those risks. So, I mean, there's a natural instinct in human beings to kind of go and look at this sort of stuff. And we need to kind of manage that as well. So, there's a huge part of the answer to this problem is around about education, which is why podcasts like this and discussions like this I think are really, really helpful.
Yeah, I agree. So I have one more question I want to ask. So as we're going through this, I was just thinking a bit. So I suspect it's similar, but I want to get it directly from you. So in intelligence, for instance, if somebody comes to us with an intelligence question, there's a request for information, request for intelligence, RFI, right? And people ask all sorts of questions. I mean, they can ask anything they want. And then, we have to go back and try to figure out how to scope that question, right? And sometimes it's the boil the ocean, tell me everything you know about so-and-so, which will never get accomplished. But sometimes it's also very granular, and there's a lot in between. But a lot of the discussion when we scope, when I've had to scope requests with clients is what's possible, what's probable, what's legal, what's ethical. What are we going to do? What aren't we going to do, right? We have to sort of set the guardrails for the investigation and then determine based on that, are we likely to get something that's of value, right? If, somebody might say they want a bunch of stuff and I've had many conversations where I'm like, well, I can't do that. That's illegal. And you have some arguments with some clients about that stuff. And I'm like, no, it's generally illegal. I'm not going to do that. It's, it's against the company policy or it's against the law or whatever it might be, right? Is it the same with you? If somebody comes to the coalition and they've got a project, they've got something in mind, do you have the same sort of a scoping discussion? Because they may not know, right? They may not know the laws in one country or another country or, international laws or as you said, there's no standards that are really well known or anything. So is it sort of the same discussion where you sit down and have to educate them in that moment about, what's inbounds, what's out of bounds, get an agreement on what the scope of work is going to be and then decide from there if it's something everybody agrees to?
Yeah. And often we will do a short piece of work up front and say, look, let's do this short piece of work and treat it almost as a scoping exercise. So we'll do a piece of work that will say, right, based on the output of that work, we think these areas are the ones that are going to be more likely to produce the output that you're looking for. And then we can do a follow-on piece of work and really look at those areas. And it's, that approach is how you investigate as well, or how you do an investigative interview. The principle is the same. You start off wide and you start to focus in and narrow in, and then you start to probe on the areas that you haven't excluded. And scoping open source intelligence projects is kind of the same.
It's good to know that. I assumed it was very similar to that. I know we talked a little bit about professionalism and standards, and it seemed like it's going to be the same. It's a research question, but I figured I would ask to make sure, because I'm sure you've had issues where you've had to push back on people who wanted things that just weren't going to happen, right? They're not legal, et cetera. And because they don't know the standards, I'm sure a lot of people think, well, you can do anything, right? You've been doing this a long time. You have 40 years experience and your partner does all this. You got hundreds of years experience around there and you're wizards with technology. And I just want you to find out, who my significant other's been spending time with. Why is that such a big issue for you to just break into their systems and get that? You have to explain, like, that's not, even if I could do it, that doesn't make it right. So I think it's interesting to find out that it's, in that regard, the professionalism is there.
If you look at the approach for investigative interviewing and the theory behind that, you always start off with wide open questions, and then you start to get closed questions where you're getting really, really specific. It's exactly the same. It's, exactly the same approach. Start off broad, exclude the things that are less likely or are from more unreliable sources, and start to focus on the things that look really promising and where there's there's evidence or indications that you're going to get the output that you're looking for. So it's it's a fairly standard way of executing investigation.
So we have a lot of practitioners that listen to the Needle Stack podcast. And is there any way for them to get involved with your coalition to help out your cause?
Well, I would love for your listeners to be able to help advocate for the development of standards, and if we could end up with a globally agreed set of standards and globally agreed certifications that everyone kind of latched onto in the same way that they did with digital forensics and cybersecurity certifications, etc. That would be a huge result, and so I'm expecting big things from your listeners, Rob.
I am as well. Thank you very much, Neil, for joining us today. And you can learn more about Neil and the Coalition for Cyber Investigators, as well as our other guests, if you go to our website, where you can find transcripts and other episode information. It's at authenticate.com/needlestack. That's authentic with the number 8.com/needlestack. And there's also a comment button on that page. We'd love to hear from you, so tell us what you think. We do read those comments. And also be sure to let us know your thoughts on social media. You can find us everywhere. We're at Needlestack Pod. And it's very important that you subscribe to Needlestack wherever you're listening or watching us today. We really appreciate you taking the time, and we don't want you to miss any future episodes. So until next time, I'm Robert Vamosi.
And I'm AJ Nash, and this has been another episode of Needlestack.